Let's kick off this explainer with a little memory test. We're going to look at some of the world's most famous pop culture icons, things you've probably seen, hundreds of times. I want you to picture them in your mind's eye, really see them. Ready? Okay, let's start with a character literally known all over the globe.
Picture the famous Pokemon Pikachu. You know the one, yellow, red cheeks, that zigzag lightning bolt tail. Now ask yourself, do you vividly remember a black tip on the very end of that tail? Take a second. Lock in your answer.
Okay, how about Rich Uncle Pennybags? You know, the famous Mr. Monopoly mascot. Top hat, fancy suit, that big bushy mustache. Would you say he wears a monocle over one eye? Again, picture that classic board game box and lock it in.
And finally, let's go way back to the Evil Queen in the classic Disney animated film Snow White. Think about that iconic scene where she's speaking to the spirit in the glass. Does she say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" All right, time for the reality check. If you said yes to literally any of those, your memory is completely playing tricks on you. No way around it. Pikachu does not have a black tip on his tail. It actually has a brown coloring at the base. Mr. Monopoly? He has never, ever worn a monocle or glasses of any kind. And in that classic Disney film, the Evil Queen absolutely never says mirror, mirror. She actually says magic mirror on the wall. Crazy, right?
Now, if you got those wrong, I promise you are far from alone. What you're experiencing is a wild cognitive phenomenon known as the Mandela Effect. It's basically the experience of a false memory, something that feels completely true and crystal clear in your head, that is entirely mistaken, yet somehow shared by massive numbers of people all across the globe. So where does the name come from? Well, it actually stems from a fascinating historical misunderstanding. The term was coined back in 2010 by a researcher named Fiona Broom. She realized that she, along with thousands of other people, had this distinct, super vivid, but entirely false memory of the anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela dying in a South African prison back in the 1980s. People even remembered watching news coverage of his funeral. But in reality, Mandela was released, became the president of South Africa, and actually lived until 2013.
And this phenomenon reaches absolutely everywhere, totally distorting our collective memories of everyday things. Think about the cereal aisle at the grocery store. It's Fruit Loops with the double O, not fruit spelled out. It's Jif peanut butter, never Jiffy. Those bear books you read as a kid, they're the Berenstain Bears, not the Berenstain Bears. It even messes with geography. So many people confidently remember New Zealand being located to the northwest of Australia, when any map will tell you it's actually down to the southeast.
So, what exactly does all this mean? How do we explain it? When millions of us share the exact same wrong memory, it can feel, well, a little spooky. Some folks look straight to alternate realities. There are literally academic physics preprints out there exploring theories about gateways to parallel universes just to explain these discrepancies. But while science fiction and shifting timelines are super fun to think about, psychological science points neutrally toward the fascinating, natural cognitive distortions of the human brain.
The fundamental truth here is that human memory is just not a video recording. It degrades. To put that into perspective, a 2020 study looked at hospital workers who were trained on fitting respirator masks. When asked to recall the event years later, the specific details they could remember plummeted to less than half of what they recalled right after the training. Over time, the hard details of our memories simply slip away.
And this natural decay sets the perfect stage for something called schema theory. This was first proposed way back in 1932 by psychologist F.C. Bartlett. Basically, it tells us that our brains actually encode memories based on our expectations. When those hard facts fade away, our minds don't just leave a blank space. Instead, they automatically fill in the missing blanks based on what logically makes sense to us, creating a sort of schema or blueprint of how things ought to be. This beautifully explains a lot of our visual glitches. Take Curious George, for instance. We know that in the real world, monkeys generally have tails, right? That's our expected schema for a monkey. So when our memory of the cartoon gets fuzzy, our brain automatically and falsely draws a tail right on him. We do the exact same thing with Mr. Monopoly. Our cultural schema associates extreme old-school wealth with top hats, spats, and monocles, so our helpful brain just transfers that expected monocle right onto his face.
However, psychologists are quick to point out that schema theory doesn't explain the whole shebang. Take the famous Fruit of the Loom logo. Thousands of people swear up and down they remember a woven brown cornucopia basket sitting behind the fruit. But a cornucopia isn't exactly an everyday object that our brains would naturally associate with a pile of fruit. We'd be much more likely to imagine a simple bowl or a plate. So,
Why a cornucopia? Schema theory definitely falls a bit short on that one.
Which brings us to another massive piece of the puzzle: conflation. Conflation happens when our brains accidentally mash similar, totally correct details together to create one entirely believable, but completely fake, new reality. We take a little bit of memory A, mix it with a little bit of memory B, and glue them together into a pastiche that feels incredibly real to us.
A perfect and honestly hilarious example of this is the 1990s genie movie Shazam, starring the comedian Sinbad. Thousands of people vividly remember watching this movie. The catch? It doesn't exist. Not at all. Psychologists believe it's actually just a massive mental mashup of three separate things: the 1996 movie Kazam, where Shaquille O'Neal plays a genie, the DC comic book hero named Shazam, and Sinbad, who happens to share a name with the fictional Middle Eastern sailor known for his supernatural adventures. Our brains literally just threw them all into a blender.
Now, memory is also heavily influenced by what researchers call the misinformation effect. Extensively demonstrated by memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus, this effect shows how entirely new outside suggestions can actually warp and rewrite our internal recollections long after an event has already happened.
In one of Loftus's most famous experiments, participants watched a video of a car crash. A bit later, they were asked if they recalled seeing any broken glass. But here was the trick. For some people, the question was phrased as how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other versus when they simply hit each other. Just by tossing in that aggressive word smashed, participants were significantly more likely to vividly and falsely remember seeing broken glass that was never actually in the video.
Then you've got to add in the familiarity heuristic. This is a mental shortcut researched by Kahneman and Tversky, and it's basically where we mistake how familiar a piece of information feels for the likelihood that it's actually the absolute truth. Remember Snow White? The original Brothers Grimm tale uses the phrase mirror, mirror, and it's been parodied that way in pop culture forever. Because we've heard it so often, our brain just assumes that's what the Disney Queen said too. Same goes for the classic movie Casablanca. People always quote "Play it again, Sam," because it sounds so familiar, even though Humphrey Bogart only ever says "play it." All of these psychological mechanics, schema, conflation, misinformation, and familiarity were brilliantly brought together in a recent University of Chicago study. Authored by scholars Wilma Bainbridge and Deepasri Prasad, this was literally the very first scientific paper to focus specifically on what they called the visual Mandela Effect, finally dragging these wild internet rumors into a rigorous lab setting. By testing participants on 40 different famous icons, the researchers proved something pretty incredible. People aren't simply failing to look at the images properly. As Assistant Professor Bainbridge noted, there is an intrinsic consistency in how human beings manufacture the exact same false memories for images they have actually never laid eyes on. Basically, our brains are all making the exact same specific errors in the exact same ways. To prove just how unbelievably strong this visual glitch really is, those UChicago researchers ran a drawing test. They asked people who were super familiar with the Monopoly brand to draw the Monopoly man completely from scratch, relying strictly on their memory. Get this, nearly 1 in 2 people spontaneously drew him wearing a monocle. Half the participants invented the exact same imaginary accessory for a character they've seen on game boxes their entire lives. That's wild. So, why does all of this actually matter outside of, say, dominating at bar trivia? Well, understanding these memory quirks is absolutely crucial for our modern world. If our brains are this eager to alter reality just to fit our expectations, we have to be incredibly careful when designing educational materials, crafting brand logos, and especially when selecting images for media and news reporting. We really don't want to accidentally spark false memories and spread misinformation at scale. Which leaves us with a truly mind-bending question as we wrap up this explainer. If your brain naturally invents these false details and shares those exact same hallucinations with millions of other people around the world, how much of your own personal past is exactly as you remember it? Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Keep questioning what you see, and thanks for joining us.